The air at the Miller place tasted of rust and defeat. It was a bitter metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat, the scent of a farm breathing its last. Jedediah Stone stood near the back of the crowd, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn denim jacket, shoulders hunched against the raw November wind that swept across the harvested soybean fields. He wasn't here for the land. He couldn't afford it, and even if he could, he wouldn't borrow to get it. He was here for the bones, the mechanical carcasses that a man with more time than money might be able to resurrect. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant was a funeral dirge for the Miller family's 80 years on this section. Up on the flatbed trailer, household goods were going for pennies on the dollar, a lifetime of memories scattered to the highest bidder. Jed ignored it. His eyes scanned the machinery lineup. A tired-looking Alice Chalmers 190 XT with fluid leaking from a rear axle seal, a New Holland Haybine with a busted sickle bar, and a John Deere 4400 combine that looked like it had swallowed a rock and died of indigestion. Everything was rode hard and put away wet. A heavy hand clapped him on the shoulder, nearly knocking him off balance. "Look at this sorry lot, eh, Jed? Miller never knew when to upgrade, tried to farm a half section with this old junk. No wonder he went under." Jed didn't have to turn to know it was Richard Peterson. Rich's voice, like everything else about him, was loud and over-polished. He'd shown up in his new Ford F-250 Ranger, the one with the two-tone paint job and the plush interior that still smelled of factory plastic. "He farmed with what he had, Rich," Jed said, his voice low and flat. "And now he has nothing," Rich boomed, laughing. He gestured with a thumb toward the auctioneer, who was starting on the land parcels. "I'm picking up his South 80, good black dirt, gonna have it tiled and ready for corn by spring. The banker at Farmers National is practically begging me to take the money." Jed just nodded, his gaze drifting past the main line of equipment toward a dilapidated barn whose roof was sagging like a tired old horse. Something massive and green was half swallowed by the overgrown thistle and burdock behind the structure. It was the color of a deep forest, faded and streaked with orange plumes of rust. "What's that back there?" Jed asked, more to himself than to Rich. Rich squinted. "Oh, that thing. Miller bought that heap from a big outfit up north that went bust 5-6 years ago. It's one of them first-gen Steigers. A Wildcat, I think. Never did get it to run right. Engines seized up tighter than a drum, I hear. It's been sitting there since the day he dragged it home. Scrap iron is all it is." Jed started walking toward it, the dry stalks of last year's weeds crunching under his work boots. The tractor was a monster. An articulated four-wheel drive, it was built out of thick plate steel, with welds as thick as his thumb. The 4 tires, all matching in their state of advanced decay, were taller than he was. The cab was a simple, boxy affair with cracked glass, and the engine hood was a long, coffin-like enclosure that hinted at the enormous diesel sleeping within. It was brutal and primitive, a dinosaur from the dawn of the four-wheel drive era. He pulled himself up on the frame, the cold steel biting through his gloves. The operator's platform was a mess of disconnected levers and wires. He peered at the engine block. It was a Caterpillar, a big one. Oil and dirt were caked on an inch thick, but he could just make out the model plate. A 3306, a legendary engine if it wasn't destroyed. Rich had followed him, a smirk plastered on his face. "What are you going to do with that lawn ornament, Jed? Gonna pull it with your mules? You ain't got mules, do you?" Jed ignored him. He ran a hand over the cold, pitted steel of the hood. He could feel the potential humming beneath the rust, a deep, resonant power that was just sleeping. This machine wasn't built on a modern assembly line. It was welded together by men in a barn in North Dakota who believed in overbuilding everything. It had good bones. The auction for the land finished up, with Rich loudly securing the 80 acres he wanted, signing the papers with a flourish right there on the hood of the auctioneer's truck. Then they moved on to the machinery. The Alice Chalmers went for a song. The combine went for scrap price. Finally, the auctioneer, tired and wanting to go home, pointed a thumb toward the derelict Steiger. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this? This yard art back here? The big green tractor. You haul it, you own it. Engines locked up, tires are shot. Who'll give me $100 for the scrap value? $100? Silence. The wind whistled through the skeletal branches of the oak trees. $50? Somebody give me 50. It's got to be 4 tons of steel. Jed raised a single finger. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. I got $50 from Jed Stone. $50. 50. Now who'll give me 60? 60. Rich Peterson let out a theatrical laugh that made heads turn. He's really going to do it. Old Jed's starting his own museum. The auctioneer looked around, his gaze pleading. No one else moved. The tractor was a liability, a multi-ton problem you had to pay to haul away. Sold, the gavel cracked like a rifle shot, to Jedediah Stone for $50. As Jed walked up to pay the clerk his 2 20s and a 10, Rich cornered him. You're a fool, Stone. While you're wasting your winter tinkering with that pile of junk, I'll be laying tile and getting ready to put in another 200 acres of corn. You can't make money turning wrenches on scrap. You make money turning dirt with new iron. The bank knows it, and I know it. Jed just folded his receipt and tucked it into his shirt pocket. I'll own my junk, Rich, he said quietly. You'll just be renting your iron from the bank. He turned and walked back toward the monstrous green tractor, his tractor, the wind at his back. He had a feeling this $50 gamble was more than just a tractor. It was a declaration of war against the new way of farming that was choking the life out of men like Miller. His father's words echoed in his mind, as clear as if the old man were standing right beside him. Debt is a chain, son. You don't own the land, the bank does. You don't own the tractor, the bank does. The minute you sign that note, you start working for them. Don't ever work for the bank. Jed looked at the colossal task ahead of him, the rust, the rot, the seized engine. It was his. All his. Before we get into the grease and the busted knuckles of bringing this beast back to life, I have to ask you all something. Have you ever taken on a project everyone said was impossible? A rusty old truck, a piece of equipment, something everyone else called junk? Let me know down in the comments what it was and how it turned out. I read every single one. Getting the Steiger home was a 3-day war. He couldn't afford a professional heavy hauler, so it had to be done the farm way. The first day was spent just getting the 4 flat, petrified tires to hold enough air to roll. He used a portable air tank, a gallon of soapy water to find the 100 tiny leaks around the rims, and a heavy hammer to reseat the beads. By dusk, the tractor was sitting up on 4 bulging, cracked tires that looked like they could explode at any second. The second day was the tow. He brought over his John Deere 4020, the pride of his fleet. It was a 1968 model, a power shift, and his father had paid cash for it brand new. It was a strong, reliable tractor, but hitched to the dead weight of the Steiger, it was like a Shetland pony trying to pull a freight train. He used a thick logging chain, doubled up, hooked to the Steiger's massive drawbar pin. The journey was a 5-mile crawl down the county's gravel roads. The 4020's diesel engine screamed in a low gear, its rear tires digging and clawing for traction. The Steiger, uncooperative and heavy, groaned and protested every inch of the way. The steering was just a suggestion, as the big articulated frame wanted to wander wherever the ruts in the road led it. Jed had to wrestle with the steering wheel, his arms and back aching. Halfway home, Rich Peterson roared past in his new International Harvester 1466, its turbocharged engine whistling. He slowed down, shook his head in mock pity, and laid on the horn before speeding off in a cloud of dust, leaving Jed in his wake, crawling along at 2 miles an hour. Every farmer who passed slowed down to gawk at the spectacle. Jed Stone, the man who refused to borrow, dragging home the biggest piece of junk in the county. It was a rolling, green and rust parade of stubbornness. By the time he finally backed the Steiger into his machine shed, the sun was setting on the 3rd day. The shed wasn't a modern pole barn like Rich's. It was an old hip-roofed barn his grandfather had built, with massive oak beams and a floor of packed earth. The Steiger filled the main bay, dwarfing his other equipment and plunging the interior into shadow. For the next week, he just circled it, studying it, planning his attack. The real work began with the engine. He pressure-washed decades of grease and grime off the big Caterpillar diesel, revealing the sheer scale of the task. He drained the oil, which came out like black tar, and pulled the valve cover. Rust, not just surface rust, but deep, pitted orange corrosion on the rockers and pushrods. Water had gotten in through the exhaust stack. This was the heart of the problem. A seized engine. He pulled the injectors and poured a coffee can full of Marvel Mystery Oil into each cylinder, hoping the thin, penetrating oil would work its way down past the piston rings. Then he did the same with diesel fuel, then automatic transmission fluid, every old farmer's trick in the book. He let it sit for a week, the sharp, chemical smell hanging heavy in the barn. The talk at the co-op was merciless. Heard Jed Stones trying to unseize that old cat engine with wishful thinking. One of the older farmers chuckled over coffee. He'd be better off using it as a boat anchor, another added. Rich Peterson, of course, held court. He's wasting his time. That block is probably cracked from the water freezing in it. He's polishing a turd. Meanwhile, I just locked in my fertilizer contract for next spring. Gonna be a banner year, boys. A banner year. Jed heard the whispers. He felt the stares when he went into town for parts, but he kept his head down and kept working. After a week of soaking, he put a 4-foot breaker bar on the crankshaft bolt at the front of the engine. He leaned into it with all his weight, his muscles straining. Nothing. It was like trying to turn a mountain. He put a 6-foot-long steel pipe over the handle of the breaker bar for more leverage. A cheetah bar. He pulled again, his boots slipping on the oily floor. The bar bowed under the strain, groaning in protest. Then, with a sickening crack, the 1/2-inch drive socket shattered, sending shrapnel flying across the shop. He spent the next month tearing the engine down. He pulled the head, a monstrous piece of cast iron that took him and his engine hoist to lift. The sight inside the cylinders made his heart sink. Rust had welded the pistons to the cylinder walls. It looked hopeless. He refused to give up. He built small dams of clay around the top of each piston and filled them with a cocktail of acetone and transmission fluid, a potent penetrating mix he'd read about in a farm journal. He let it sit. He tapped the tops of the pistons with a wooden block and a sledgehammer, hoping the vibrations would break the rust's grip. Day after day, nothing. The community had written him off as the local eccentric, a man clinging to an obsolete past. His farm was neat, his fences were straight, and his small herd of cattle was healthy, but he wasn't expanding. He wasn't participating in the great boom. He was seen as a man going backward. Then, one cold December morning, he decided to try again. He put the long cheetah bar back on the crank bolt, using a new impact socket this time. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and pulled. He put every ounce of his being into it, his face turning red with exertion. For a long second, nothing happened. Then he heard it. Not a loud crack, but a low, deep groan from the bowels of the engine. A screech of metal on metal that was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It moved. Just a fraction of an inch, but it moved. The rust had broken its grip. He leaned on the bar again, and it moved another fraction. He worked it back and forth, a 1/4 of an inch each way, for what felt like hours. Slowly, painstakingly, he got the crankshaft to make one full, agonizing rotation. He stood up, covered in grease and sweat despite the cold, and a slow grin spread across his face. It was a small victory, a battle won in a long war, but it was everything. He wasn't just fixing a tractor, he was proving them all wrong. The whispers, the smirks, the pity. This giant would breathe again. The cost was high, not just in money for parts he'd have to buy, but in time. Time he could have spent planning for next season or repairing fences. He sold 10 steer calves to the sale barn to build up his cash reserve for the engine rebuild kit. New pistons, rings, liners, bearings, and a complete gasket set. He paid cash for it all, his bank account dwindling while Rich Peterson's line of credit swelled. The boom of the mid-1970s was a fever that swept across the heartland. Driven by massive grain sales to the Soviet Union and a weak dollar, commodity prices shot to the moon. On the radio, Secretary of Agriculture Earl Boots was a preacher, and his sermon was simple: get big or get out. Farmers were told to plant fence row to fence row, to tear out the windbreaks and drain the wetlands. Land that had been $1,000 an acre was suddenly $2,000, then $3,000. And the banks were handing out money like it was candy at a parade. It was a time of boundless, intoxicating optimism. Richard Peterson was riding the crest of that wave. He was no longer just a neighbor, he was becoming an empire builder. He'd bought the Miller 80 and then another 40 from a widow down the road. He traded in his already newish International Harvester 1466 for a brand new top-of-the-line IH 4366, a beautiful red articulated four-wheel drive that was the talk of the county. It had an air-conditioned cab with a radio and tinted glass. Rich would sit up there in his clean shirt, farming in comfort, while Jed was out on his open station 4020, eating dust. Rich built a new machine shed, a massive steel structure that gleamed in the sun. He put up 2 new 50,000-bushel grain bins with automatic augers. His wife, who used to drive a sensible Ford Pinto, was now seen around town in a brand new Mercury Grand Marquis station wagon with fake wood paneling on the sides. Rich was the model of the new progressive farmer. He was featured in the local paper, standing in front of his new tractor, talking about expansion and efficiency. He looked at Jed now with a kind of patronizing pity. "Jed, you're missing the boat," he'd say, leaning against the counter at the co-op. "Corn is $4 a bushel. You could pay for a new tractor in 2 seasons. You're sitting on 200 acres, debt-free. The bank would give you $1 million tomorrow. You're working twice as hard for half as much." Jed would just nod and pay for his parts in cash. "I'm doing all right, Rich." Doing all right was an understatement. The high grain prices were good for everyone. Jed had 2 of the best crop years of his life. But instead of leveraging his profits into more land and new equipment, he did what his father had taught him. He paid his taxes, put 1/3 of the profit into savings, 1/3 into farm improvements, and the last third went into the Steiger project. His barn became a sanctuary of methodical resurrection. The big Caterpillar 3306 engine was completely torn down. He took the block and headed to a machine shop in the city to have them magnafluxed for cracks and decked flat. He bought new cylinder liners, pistons, rings and bearings. He spent his evenings in the winter of '76 meticulously cleaning every single nut and bolt, laying out the parts on clean rags. He reassembled the engine with the precision of a watchmaker, torquing every head bolt to spec, checking every clearance with a plastigauge. By the spring of 1977, the engine was back in the massive green frame. The moment of truth came on a cool April evening. He had the fuel lines bled and the batteries charged. He climbed up into the crude operator's seat, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The starter motor groaned, turning the massive engine over slowly. 1 revolution, 2, 3. Then a cylinder fired, sending a puff of white smoke out of the straight pipe exhaust. Another cylinder caught, and then another, and suddenly the barn was filled with a deafening, earth-shaking roar. The big Cat diesel bellowed to life, settling into a deep, loping idle that vibrated through the concrete floor and up into Jed's bones. It was a raw, mechanical sound, a symphony of controlled explosions that spoke of immense power. He let it run for 20 minutes, his eyes glued to the new oil pressure and temperature gauges he had installed. Everything was perfect, but the tractor was far from ready. The engine was alive, but the hydraulics were a nightmare of leaking seals and cracked hoses. The transmission had a worrying whine in one of the gears. The tires were still a major liability. The project consumed his summer. When he wasn't in the fields with his 4020, he was in the barn, wrestling with the Steiger. He rebuilt the hydraulic cylinders one by one, replacing every O-ring and seal. He fabricated new hoses. He split the tractor in the middle, a monumental task that involved chain hoists and heavy jacks, to get at the transmission, discovering a chipped tooth on a planetary gear that had to be replaced. By the fall of 1977, it was finally moving under its own power. It wasn't pretty. The paint was a patchwork of original faded green, rust and red oxide primer. The cab glass was still cracked, but it was mechanically sound. He hooked it up to his 24-foot chisel plow, an implement that made his 4020 work hard. He dropped the plow into the hard, dry ground of a harvested cornfield, throttled the Steiger up, and let out the clutch. The tractor didn't even flinch. The big diesel barely changed its tune as the chisel shanks bit deep into the earth, pulling up huge slabs of compacted soil. The raw, brute force was intoxicating. He was doing in one pass what used to take him 2, and at twice the speed. For the first time, Jed felt a surge of triumph. The $50 gamble, the endless hours, the ridicule. It was all paying off. He finished his full tillage in record time. As he worked, he could see the lights of Rich Peterson's operation burning late into the night. Rich was farming nearly 1,000 acres now, a sprawling enterprise of steel and debt. As Jed shut the Steiger down on the last day of fieldwork, a profound sense of quiet satisfaction settled over him. His crops were in the bin, owned and clear. His machinery, old as it was his. The monstrous green tractor sat cooling in the twilight, ticking and groaning, a testament to his own stubborn philosophy. But a cold wind was picking up from the northwest, carrying with it a sense of unease. On the radio in the barn, the news was all about the rising price of oil, inflation, and a man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve who was talking about raising interest rates to cool down the economy. An old-timer at the feed store had shaken his head that morning. "This all feels a little too good to be true," he'd mumbled. "Reminds me of the stories my daddy told me about 1929. Jed looked across the darkening fields toward the bright distant lights of Rich's farm, then back at his own modest, quiet homestead. The first snowflakes of what would be a long, brutal winter began to drift down from the leaden sky, melting as they touched the still warm hood of the big green tractor. The stage was being set, and the main player, the blizzard of '78, was waiting in the wings. The winter of 1978 arrived not as a season, but as an invading army. It began in January with a series of snowfalls that laid down a deep, solid base, followed by a bitter cold that locked the land in a grip of iron. The old-timers looked at the sky, at the way the smoke from their chimneys hung low and heavy, and they muttered about the winter of '36. Jedediah felt it in his bones, a deep, resonant cold that the old furnace in his farmhouse struggled to fight. He spent his days in the machine shed, methodically going over the Steiger. He knew its weaknesses. In this kind of cold, diesel fuel could turn to gel, batteries lost their power, and steel became brittle. He installed a heavy-duty block heater, splicing it directly into the Caterpillar's coolant system. He built a makeshift battery warmer out of an old insulated box and a single light bulb. He switched to a winter-grade fuel and added an anti-gel supplement, stirring the concoction in the big saddle tanks with a clean wooden paddle. He was preparing for a siege. Across the section, Rich Peterson's operation was buttoned up tight. His new International 4366 sat clean inside the heated workshop of his new machine shed. It was a marvel of modern engineering, a testament to his success. Rich felt secure. He had the best equipment money could buy, a warm shop to work in, and a line of credit that felt bottomless. Then the blizzard hit. It came on a Wednesday afternoon, a wall of white that erased the horizon. The wind shrieked like a banshee, piling snow into drifts that buried fence lines and swallowed roads. For 2 days and 2 nights, the world outside was a swirling, featureless chaos. The power went out. The phone lines went dead. Every farm became an island, isolated in a sea of white. On the 3rd morning, the wind finally died, leaving behind a world transformed. The silence was absolute, the landscape alien and beautiful and terrifying. Drifts 10 and 15 feet high sculpted the terrain. Jed's house was nearly buried on the north side. He shoveled his way to the barn, the air so cold it felt like breathing needles. Inside the dark, frigid machine shed, he plugged the Steiger's block heater into his PTO-driven generator, which he'd fired up an hour earlier. He let it warm the big engine's core for a solid 90 minutes. Then he climbed aboard. He hit the ether button for just a second. A quick, sharp sniff to wake the giant, and turned the key. The engine turned over slowly, sluggishly, protesting the deep zero cold. But it turned. It coughed once, twice, and then erupted into a thunderous roar that shook the snow from the barn's rafters. The straight pipe exhaust shot a plume of black smoke into the still morning air. Jed let it idle high, watching the gauges climb, the deep thrum of the Caterpillar a reassuring heartbeat in the frozen silence. A few hours later, he saw movement on the road. A figure on a snowmobile, fighting its way through the massive drifts. It was Rich Peterson's son, a boy of 16, his face red and raw from the cold. He shut off the noisy machine and stumbled toward Jed. "Dad sent me," the boy said, his voice trembling. "It's Grandma. She lives with us now. We think she's having a heart attack. She's bad, Mr. Stone, real bad. We called the ambulance before the lines went dead, but they'll never get through." He pointed back toward his farm. "Dad's been trying to start the big International for hours. The heater in the shop went out when the power failed. The fuel's gelled up and the batteries are dead. He can't get it to even turn over. He asked if you could help." The request hung in the air between them, heavier than the cold itself. Rich Peterson, the man with the best of everything, was helpless. His modern marvel, with its sophisticated hydraulics and complex systems, was frozen solid. Jed just nodded. "Get in the house and get warm. Tell your mother to get her ready. I'm coming." He backed the Steiger out of the shed. The huge tires, nearly 6 feet tall, churned through the deep snow. He had a 20-foot logging chain and a homemade V-plow he'd fabricated years ago. He hooked up the plow to the tractor's front mounts. The machine was a brute, a simple beast of steel and power. It had no fancy electronics to fail, no delicate sensors to freeze. It had a massive engine, a simple gear-driven transmission, and 4 huge tires that clawed for traction. It took him over an hour to clear the half-mile of road between their farms. The drifts were immense, solid walls of packed snow that would have stopped a county plow. The Steiger didn't slow down. Jed kept the engine revving high, the turbo whistling, and aimed the tractor's nose into the heart of the drifts. The V-plow hit them like the prow of an icebreaker, exploding snow 30 feet into the air. The tractor bucked and strained, the tires spinning and digging, but it never stopped moving forward. It was a display of raw, unstoppable force. When he pulled into Rich's yard, he saw the scene of futility. The big red International was hooked up to 2 pickups with jumper cables, its hood open. Rich, his face a mask of grease and desperation, was trying to thaw the fuel lines with a propane torch, a dangerous, last-ditch effort. He looked up as the monstrous green tractor rumbled into the yard, and for the first time, Jed saw the swagger gone from his neighbor's face. All that was left was fear. They didn't waste words. They bundled Rich's mother in blankets and carefully placed her in the Steiger's cramped cab, Jed's wife sitting beside her to keep her calm. Jed climbed back into the driver's seat, Rich standing on the steps outside, holding on for dear life. The 10-mile journey to the hospital in town was a grueling 4-hour battle against the storm's aftermath. The Steiger was their ark. It plowed through drifts that had swallowed cars and trucks whole. It was the only thing moving in the entire county. They made it. As the doctors rushed Rich's mother into the emergency room, Rich grabbed Jed's arm. His hands were shaking. "Jed, thank you. You saved her life." He looked at the big green tractor, idling patiently, its exhaust puffing rhythmically in the cold air. "I laughed at you for buying this thing, called you a fool." His voice broke. "God, what a fool I was." That day, the first deep cracks appeared in Richard Peterson's empire. It wasn't about money or land, but about a fundamental truth. When everything was stripped away by the storm, his new, expensive, and complex machine had failed him. It was the old, simple, overbuilt iron, resurrected by a patient hand, that had delivered salvation. The whispers at the co-op began to change. Jed Stone wasn't an eccentric fool. He was the man who had opened the county when no one else could. The blizzard of '78 was a physical storm, but it was just the prelude to the economic hurricane that was about to make landfall on the American heartland. The late '70s gave way to the '80s, and the music changed. The optimism curdled into fear. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and President Carter responded with a grain embargo. Suddenly, the biggest customer for American corn and soybeans was gone. Commodity prices, which had seemed to only go up, began a sickening slide. At the same time, the Federal Reserve, under the iron-willed leadership of Paul Volcker, declared war on inflation. He jacked up interest rates to levels not seen in a lifetime. The prime rate, the number that banks based their loans on, soared past 20%. It was a brutal, necessary medicine for the national economy, but for farmers leveraged to the hilt like Rich Peterson, it was a death sentence. Rich was trapped. He had borrowed millions of dollars when money was cheap and corn was expensive. Now, money was impossibly expensive and corn was cheap. His operating loans were on variable rates. One day his banker called him in. The man who had once begged Rich to take money now sat across the desk with a grim face. "Rich, your note is renewing at 18%, the banker said, avoiding his eyes, "and with land values falling, the bank is going to need you to put up more collateral." Rich felt the floor drop out from under him. 18%. His profit margins, even in the best of years, were never that high. He was now paying the bank more to use the money than he could possibly earn from the land he'd bought with it. He was farming for the bank, and he was losing. The stress began to show. The confident boom in Rich's voice was replaced by a quiet, haunted tone. His new equipment started to look worn, the maintenance deferred to save cash. He sold off his wife's fancy station wagon. He started laying off the hired hands he'd employed to run his 1,000-acre operation. He was trying to do it all himself, working from before dawn until long after dusk, a man running on a treadmill that was speeding up while tilting downhill. Jed watched it happen with a heavy heart. He was struggling too. The low prices meant his own profits were razor-thin. But the difference was profound. He had no debt. His land, his house, his machinery, they were all his. The John Deere 4020, the old New Holland baler, and especially the Steiger. They didn't send him a bill every month. When a hydraulic hose on the Steiger burst, Jed didn't have to call a dealer for an expensive service call. He drove to town, paid $20 cash for a new hose and fittings, and fixed it himself in an hour. When the injector pump on Rich's new International started acting up, the repair bill was over $2,000. Money Rich didn't have. His state-of-the-art tractor sat idle for a week while he scrambled to find the cash. Jed survived by living the creed his father had taught him. He kept his costs low. He did his own repairs. He raised cattle, which gave him a source of income separate from the volatile grain markets. The Steiger was the linchpin of his survival. Its sheer power and efficiency allowed him to get his fieldwork done in narrow windows of good weather, and its fuel consumption per acre was surprisingly good for its size. More importantly, it was simple. The big Caterpillar engine had no computers. The transmission was a collection of gears and bearings he could understand and fix himself. He was the master of his machine, not its servant. The final collapse for Rich came in the fall of 1983. It was a notice in the paper, a small black-and-white block of text that announced a foreclosure auction at the Peterson farm. The bank was calling in its notes. The empire was being dismantled. The talk at the co-op was somber now. The laughter was gone. Everyone knew a family that was going under. The men who had once mocked Jed for his old iron were now desperately trying to keep their own 5-year-old equipment running because they couldn't afford to trade. The get big or get out sermon had led them to a cliff. Jed saw the auction notice and felt a deep, aching sorrow. There was no triumph, no sense of, "I told you so." There was only the tragedy of a good man who had followed bad advice, a man who had believed in a dream that had turned into a nightmare. He thought of that day during the blizzard, of Rich's face, stripped of all pride, asking for help. He knew he had to go to the auction, not to pick over the bones, but to bear witness, and perhaps to offer a different kind of help. The day of the Peterson auction was a grey, windswept day in March, eerily similar to the Miller auction years before. The mood, however, was different. There was no optimism, no land-hungry buyers eager to expand. There was only a grim sense of finality. The crowd was thin, mostly neighbors and a few implement dealers looking for bargains. Jed saw Rich standing near the house, his shoulders slumped, looking like a stranger on his own farm. His wife was beside him, her face pale. The auctioneer started with the small items, then moved to the machinery line. The big, gleaming equipment that had been Rich's pride and joy was now just collateral, inventory to be liquidated. The International 4366, the tractor that was supposed to represent the future of farming, was put up on the block. It had been a $100,000 machine just a few years ago. "All right, what am I bid for this fine International Harvester 4-wheel drive?" the auctioneer chanted, his voice lacking its usual energy. "Let's start it at $20,000. Who'll give me 20? Silence. The dealers knew the market was flooded with used equipment from other farm failures. The neighbors didn't have the cash or the credit. 15,000, give me 15. A dealer raised a hand. 15. I got 15, now 16, 16,000. Jed saw Rich flinch. His prized tractor, the symbol of his ambition, was being sold for pennies on the dollar. Jed thought of his own tractor, the $50 junker that had saved his neighbor's mother and his own farm. He thought of his father's words, and he knew what he had to do. He waited until the bidding stalled at $17,500. Then, in the heavy silence, Jed raised his hand. $25,000, he said, his voice clear and steady. A gasp went through the small crowd. Heads turned. The dealer who had been bidding just shook his head and dropped out. Rich looked over at Jed, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, slamming his hand down, "to Jedediah Stone for $25,000. Jed didn't go to look at his new purchase. He walked over to Rich. The two men stood there for a moment, the raw wind whipping around them. "Why, Jed?" Rich asked, his voice thick with emotion. "You overpaid by at least $7,000. Why would you do that?" "Because it's a good tractor," Jed said simply, "and because the bank doesn't deserve to steal it from you. That extra money is yours, Rich. It'll help you land on your feet." Then Jed did something more. He looked at the land, the home quarter where Rich had grown up, where his father had farmed before him. "I'm buying your home 80 from the bank, Rich," he said quietly, "and I'm going to lease it back to you for $1 a year. You'll farm it with your old John Deere, the one you started with. And when you're back on your feet, you're going to buy it back from me for exactly what I paid for it. Not a penny more." Rich Peterson stared at him, his eyes welling up. He had lost his empire, but in that moment he hadn't lost his dignity. He had been offered not charity, but a chance, a lifeline thrown by the very man he had once ridiculed. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a grace he had never expected. The years that followed were lean, but they were healing. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving a scarred but wiser landscape. The community had changed. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet resilience. Farmers started talking more about managing debt than about buying new equipment. They began patching up old tractors, learning to weld and fabricate. And when they needed advice, they often found themselves leaning against the fender of an old green Steiger in Jed Stone's machine shed. Jed never got bigger. He kept his 200 acres, farmed it well, and stayed out of debt. He used both the Steiger and the International, finding that each had its place. He hired Rich to help him during planting and harvest, and the two men worked side by side, a quiet respect between them. Rich, freed from the crushing weight of his debt, rediscovered his love for the simple act of farming. He eventually saved enough to buy his home 80 back from Jed, just as they had agreed. One warm summer evening, years later, Jed was in the barn with his grandson, a boy of 12 with grease on his hands and curiosity in his eyes. The boy was looking at the Steiger, which now wore a fresh coat of green paint, but still bore the scars of its hard life like badges of honor. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why do we keep this old tractor? It's so loud and clunky. Dad says we could get a new one with a quiet cab and a radio and GPS." Jed wiped his hands on a rag and sat down on an overturned bucket. He looked at the massive machine, its steel frame solid and permanent. "This tractor," he began, his voice soft, "is more than just iron and grease. It's a lesson. Back in the 70s, everyone was borrowing money to buy new, shiny things. They thought bigger was always better. They built their farms on sand, on borrowed money. And when the storm came, it all washed away." He pointed to the big Caterpillar engine. "This old giant here, everyone said it was junk, scrap iron, but it had good bones. It was built simple and strong. We didn't borrow a penny for it. We paid for it with $50 and a whole lot of work. When times got tough, it didn't owe anybody anything. It just worked. It pulled us through. It pulled our neighbors through." He put a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Don't ever forget that. Debt is a chain. It feels light at first, but it gets heavier every year. You own your land, you own your tools, and you answer to no one but God and the seasons. That's freedom. That's what this tractor stands for." The boy looked from his grandfather to the old tractor, understanding dawning in his eyes. Outside, the sun was setting over the fields, casting long shadows. From across the section, the faint rumble of another tractor could be heard. Rich Peterson, working the land he had almost lost. the land he now truly owned. Jed smiled. The big green machine sat silent in the twilight, its engine cool. It had won the war not with speed or technology, but with endurance. It was a monument of steel, a testament to the quiet, stubborn wisdom of a man who knew the difference between the price of something and its true worth. And it would be here, ready for the next generation, its heart of iron still beating strong.